happy little games. In the mid-1980s, it was a great time to be a teenager, especially if you liked action movies. Steroid-fueled with explosions of mundo were all the rage, and I lapped them up like a dog eats peanut butter. Some of my personal favorites during this time were Rambo Part 2, Commando, and Predator. Arcade manufacturers took note and wanted to cash in on the action flick craze. SNK would later go on to create the stellar Neo Geo, was one of the earliest companies to produce such a game, and that is the one we are talking about today, Ikari Warriors. What was the major influence for this game? What was so unique about the controls in this game? So put on your bandana and get ready to kill the bad guys, because this is the history of the Ikari Warriors Trilogy. The year is 1985 and SNK designer Kaiko Liu is hard at work on her first arcade project. Japanese companies had no problem stealing ideas from their competitors, and arcade manufacturers were no different. A lot of times they were hesitant about putting a game into a test market because spies from other companies would be on the lookout and report back to their bosses. If it was something good, they were instructed to create something similar but get it done as quick as possible. Miss Liu saw Capcom's Commando on test location and set out to create something similar but only with 2 players. Late in development, the bosses at SNK had noticed how popular the character of Rambo was and instructed her to change the characters to more resemble the muscle-bound Vietnam vet. So she took off their shirts and gave them bandanas. What kind of a game is this? And was ready to unleash this game on the world. The characters look extremely similar to Rambo, with the title character even having the same color bandana. So I'm surprised that a lawsuit was never brought about. People are often curious where the name Ikari came from. The name is taken from the Japanese title of the movie Rambo, Ikari no Das Hutsu, or Rambo the Furious Escape. Commando was a huge hit, but SNK wanted to update the gaming experience by adding 2-player simultaneous play and also innovate the controls. They decided to add an 8-way joystick with a rotary dial built in, allowing you to move in one direction but shoot in another. 1982's Frontline had something similar with a rotating dial. The first game to use the rotary joystick was SNK's Tank 3, which came out a year before Ikari Warriors. This game is also considered the forerunner to the Ikari lineage and even featured the character of Ralph. Ikari Warriors blasted into arcades in 1986. You take on the role of Ralph Jones and Clark Steele, who also appeared in SNK's later hits King of Fighters and Metal Slug. Their mission is to reach the village of Ikari while blasting enemy soldiers and blowing up tanks in an attempt to rescue their commanding officer, Colonel Cook. The game is a simultaneous 2-player run-and-gun adventure in which you have to traverse up the screen, similar in style to Commando and Gunsmoke. Let me just start out by saying that this game is very difficult as getting off the toilet after Taco Tuesday. Along with the rotating joystick, you have 2 buttons at your disposal, one for grenades and one for your machine gun. You do have a limited supply of ammunition, but there are plenty of refill icons along the way. Your ammunition will be restored if you die. The various enemies who will attack you are the standard blue enemies, red enemies who will drop power-ups which will increase the power of your bullets and grenades, give you more ammunition, or even kill all enemies. There are also kamikaze soldiers who would love nothing better than to ruin your day by blowing you up. Not only do you have to contend with all of the soldiers, but there are tanks that move back and forth trying their best to blast you to Kingdom Come. There are helicopters that will try to shoot you from above, and even giant rock faces that will spit arrows at you. Sensors will pop out of the ground after stepping on certain spots that will unleash homing missiles, which are pretty much unavoidable. It is possible to commandeer tanks, which will not only let you shoot the enemies but run them over in a nice, satisfying way. You have to be careful though, because some tanks are rigged to explode as soon as you get nearby. While in the tank, it is possible for it to catch on fire and explode, so you'll have to exit it as quickly as possible. As with most games at the time, it's a one-hit wonder type of world, which means you will die repeatedly. The difficulty is brutal, and it does help to have that second player. The game takes place across one long scrolling level with roadblocks appearing every so often. The very last area sees you come across the dictator who has kidnapped Colonel Cook, but apparently he got on the wrong side of somebody because he is just a rotting corpse. Somehow his chair is linked to 4 fast-firing cannons, so you have to be on your toes. After defeating them, you head on up to free Colonel Cook, who has apparently had a touch of gigantism in the meantime because he is huge.
That's what she said.
Colonel Cook is literally 4 times the size of our titular heroes. After completing the game, you receive a nice congratulatory screen, complete with a few phrases of English thrown in. In Japan, the arcade game is known simply as Ikari, and the enemies were neo-Nazis as evidenced by a large swastika on the carpet at the end of the game. The game was ported to a number of home systems, which I will cover at the end of the video. In 1986, Victory Road was released by SNK. This is the follow-up to the successful Ikari Warriors, only this time taking place in space. As the story goes, after rescuing Colonel Cook, Ralph and Clark board their plane and are headed back to America. Suddenly, a storm appears and they are transported thousands of years into the future. They meet an alien creature who says the dastardly villain Zong Zip has taken over the land. It's up to our 2 shirtless, muscle-bound heroes to blast their way to his palace and end his dictatorship once and for all. The game follows the same layout as the first one, with one long continuous scrolling level with mini-bosses breaking up the monotony. The controls themselves are pretty much unchanged, with the rotating joystick making its return. Once again, you have dedicated gun and grenade buttons, only this time you have unlimited ammunition, which also includes any weapon you happen to pick up along the way. Some of the weapons you can pick up include large bazookas, which will plow right through the enemies and certain walls, a steel boomerang that will cut the enemies down like a knife through butter, and a giant sword which will kill enemies just by touching them. Another sort of power-up is the eyeball, which will let you locate hidden items in the scenery. The tanks from the first game are missing, but there are various suits of armor which will let you take a certain number of hits before disintegrating. You either have to toss grenades or use the bazooka to blast through walls to either retrieve hidden items or to create a pathway. The enemy types are much more varied this time around, including green little buggers who sort of resemble something I leave behind in my toilet after Taco Tuesday. Spiders that have a tendency to hop all around, guards who will shoot you mercilessly, airborne creatures who will swoop in from the side shooting you while flying erratically, and statues that will blast starbursts. There are actual bosses this time around instead of the roadblocks found in the first game. Every so often a green tile will appear on the ground. If you happen to step anywhere near them, you will be transported into a mini-boss fight with either a multi-headed dragon or the same stone face that taunted you at the beginning of the game. The final boss is particularly brutal, so you better have plenty of coins or have the game set on free play. The graphics have been given a slight upgrade over the original, and so has the sound, with some digitized samples thrown in from not only the final boss of the game, but also Clark and Ralph when you come back to life. The difficulty has also increased, making an already near impossible game flat out impossible. It's still fun to play though, especially in 2-player mode. The game was ported to a number of home systems, including the Commodore 64, Apple II, NES, Atari ST, Amiga, Amstrad, ZX Spectrum, IBM PC, and PSP.
Come on, let's fight. Come on, let's fight.
After 3 well-deserved years of R&R, Ralph and Clark were called back into duty in Ikari 3: The Rescue. At the time, arcade beat-em-ups were extremely popular, with the likes of Double Dragon and Golden Axe ruling the arcades. This prompted SNK to make the biggest change in the gameplay that nobody saw coming. Instead of taking place in space, the heroes are transported back into the jungle to rescue the president's son from a terrorist organization. Like its predecessors, this is a simultaneous 2-player game that scrolls not only vertically but also horizontally as well. The game takes place across 6 varied levels with pretty cool mini-bosses at the end. The first thing you notice after being dropped in the jungle is that you have no weapons. That's right, this is no longer a run-and-gun shoot-'em-up extravaganza, but instead is turned into a punch-and-run, which is what I would do whenever I got into a fight. Instead of the standard gun and grenade buttons, you have dedicated punch, kick, and jump buttons. The punches are delivered just a little bit faster than the kicks, and they do dish out more punishment. You also have a jump kick, which is the most powerful tool in your unarmed arsenal. The rotating joystick from previous games also returned, but doesn't quite feel right in this scenario. Thankfully, SNK released a version of the game with a standard joystick, which plays a whole lot better in my opinion. There are 3 weapons you can pick up in the game, which include knives that the soldiers drop and will do significant damage. They will also throw grenades that you can pick up and throw back at them. Speaking of explosions, you can find dynamite barrels or crates that will instantly destroy anything in its perimeter. The third weapon you can pick up is the rifle, which holds 20 shots and sure feels good after all that knuckle-busting action. If you are worried about the guns that the enemies carry, well, worry no more, because they have been stripped of their machinery as well. That's not to say that the game is a cakewalk, because the sheer amount of enemies is overwhelming, just like the previous 2 games. The enemy types are not as varied as in the previous games, with a standard multicolored soldier who all have the same abilities and a roughneck with a headband. They come at you from all angles and will gang up on you relentlessly. One other new enemy type are the bearded soldiers, who can kill you in 2 hits. You also have to contend with tanks and helicopters, and if you don't have a gun, it's fist on metal as you punch and kick it to the great beyond. A thankful addition is the inclusion of a life bar, but that comes with a not so thankful inclusion of a time limit. The time limit is displayed as distance from the enemy, and the more you traverse through the level, you gain more distance from them. If it reaches 0, the enemies surround you and you are captured. At this point, you have to start the entire level all the way back at the beginning. The graphics have been given a significant upgrade from the previous 2 games, and they look really nice with fairly good animation. The levels are also much more varied, including rivers, jungles, deserts, bridges, and heliports. There were even nice cutscenes in between each level. The music and sound effects have also been upgraded, with a few clear voice samples thrown in. It's a fun game to play, but in my opinion, it just doesn't feel like Ikari Warriors without the traditional weapons. The game was converted to a few systems, including the NES, Commodore 64, MS-DOS, and PSP. Ralph and Clark would later go on to become playable characters in the games Metal Slug 5 and 6. They would also appear throughout the King of Fighters series as a part of Team Ikari, alongside other members such as Leona and Colonel Cook. Now let's talk about the various conversions. It was converted to a number of platforms with varying degrees of success. The one glaring difference from the arcade, aside from the graphics and sound, is the lack of a rotating joystick, which means you can only shoot in the direction you are facing. The home version most people are familiar with is the NES version. To pad out the game, additional content was added in the forms of more varied enemies and gameplay. There are now even large warriors who use clubs instead of guns, elite soldiers, and also robots. Even the mini-bosses at the end are completely different or in the wrong order. Instead of one long continuous stage, the game is split up into 4 separate ones, but these are all extremely long. The game is even more difficult than its arcade big brother thanks to its limited controls. There are still plenty of enemies and bullets are flying, so again, you have to be on your toes. Along with being able to drive the tank, you also get to fly the helicopter, which lets you use the machine gun to cut up your enemies like Swiss cheese. The only downside to this is that the helicopter will eventually run out of gas and crash with no way of being able to exit once you are in. The graphics are simply adequate with murky colors and limited sound effects and music. Back in the day, I enjoyed this one. Nowadays, not so much. Now let's take a look at the beautiful, stupendous, absolutely gorgeous... I'm sorry. Even I can only polish a turd so much. The Atari 2600 version is absolutely terrible. Possibly the worst arcade conversion ever. Considering this game came out in 1990, a full 13 years after the system launched, it's understandable why this version would look so bad. What's not understandable is why the people at Atari would continue to suck the unit dry, even though a competent conversion could never be accomplished on this hardware. The sprites are an ugly, discombobulated mess. When you kill an enemy or blow up a building, they just disappear as if they were a ghost. The scrolling is smooth, which is about the only positive thing I could find in this game. A variation, and I use that term loosely, of the theme song plays in the background, but of course it doesn't sound great. You can only move vertical and horizontal in the tanks and not diagonally, which you could do in the arcade version. Also, when your tank is hit, it just disappears, not even giving you a chance to escape. To top things off, there are no power-up icons either. If the name of your game is pain, then this is the game for you. Sticking with the Atari line, let's take a look at the 7800 version. This was released on aging hardware that was developed in 1983, although it wouldn't see a worldwide release until 1986. Despite these limitations, this is an excellent conversion and a whole lot better than the 2600 fiasco. The game opens up with the arcade attract animation, and we even get 2-player simultaneous action. The graphics and animation, while not quite as sharp as its NES counterpart, still look good with nice vibrant colors. The music is just there, which is about all I can say for it. It's not bad, but there are only 2 tracks in the game, one being the title screen music and the other which plays all throughout the game on a loop. The controls are much better than the 2600 version, allowing your character to move diagonally and also shoot in different directions while moving. Even the tanks can roll along diagonally. The collision detection is a bit iffy though, especially when trying to enter the tanks. This game more faithfully replicates the arcade level layout than the NES version, so arcade purists will absolutely love this version. The good old Commodore 64 received not 1 but 2 conversions of this classic arcade game. Let's take a look at the one released for the USA market. This one is not very good. The graphics and animation are not very detailed, with your character having blue hair instead of black. Also, when you die, every enemy, tank, and cannon that's on the screen will die and get destroyed as well. The game moves along at a fairly decent pace, but sometimes there is a ton of flicker on the screen. There is no 2-player simultaneous mode, along with totally different stage layouts from the arcade game. The hit detection is not good either, especially with the grenades. Thankfully, a short time later, something much better would come along. A few months later, the game was released by Elite in Europe for the Commodore 64. This is a brand new conversion built from the ground up. The first thing you notice when you boot the game up is that it has the original arcade opening if you're playing Crashing in the Jungle. The graphics look a whole lot better, although the sprites are smaller in scale than the USA version. The animation is also well done and a big step up from the previous game. The sound effects and music are put to good use, with the SID chip belting out a good rendition of the arcade's theme song. There doesn't appear to be any flicker in this game as well, which is always a good thing. The controls feel fantastic and are nice and responsive. The horrible collision detection that was present in the USA version is much better in this one. Overall, every category is a big step up from its USA counterpart. Sticking with the Commodore line, let's check out the Commodore 16 version. The graphics, while a bit on the blocky side, are fairly detailed, but the problem comes with the colors. They are extremely dull and drab. The animation is smooth along with the scrolling, which makes for a better gameplay experience. There is no music, although we do have sound effects, which are absolutely eardrum piercing after a short time of playing. The controls are responsive, but you can only fire up and not necessarily in the direction you are facing. Although it's not a good conversion as we've seen before, it's not the worst one either. let's take a look at the MSX2 version. The graphics are nice and detailed with colorful sprites all throughout. The animation is a little ropey, especially when there are lots of enemies on the screen. Speaking of enemies, they don't disappear when you kill them, they just lay on the ground until the screen is littered with bodies. There is music while you play, and the sound effects are pretty good, including some digitized grunts and groans, especially when you die. The speed of the game isn't bad, but it's not quite arcade perfect. The controls are decent except for the hit detection being just a bit off. I would have been perfectly happy to play this on my home computer back in the day. The ZX Spectrum version is up next, and when this was released it received high marks across the board. The speed of the game is really quick and it flows quite nicely. The color clash has been kept to a minimum, although the sprites are monochrome. The graphics are detailed with smooth animation. We also get good sound effects as well. The controls are nice and tight and it feels like the arcade game. This is really well done, especially considering the hardware it's running on. Now let's check out the Amstrad version. The graphics are fairly detailed and so is the animation. The scrolling is not quite as smooth as the Spectrum version, but having that nice blast of color sure does help. We even get sound effects and music and they both sound terrific. The speed of the game is on par with the arcade original. The controls are very responsive and you will be blowing up the enemies with ease. This is a very good conversion, and if you are an Amstrad fan, you should check it out. The Atari ST version is the first of the 16 bits we are going to look at. The graphics are nice and detailed, with the character sprites immediately being recognizable. The animation is also nice and smooth, although there is some slowdown when a lot of action appears on the screen. We get the arcade attract screen and the intro, so this really does feel like the arcade game thanks to the presentation. You even have the option for simultaneous two-player action. The music is pretty good with a nice rendition of the arcade tune playing in the background. The controls are responsive, although there is no way they can replicate the rotating joystick. Overall though, it's a really good conversion. The Amiga version looks very similar to the Atari ST, but with slightly smoother scrolling and faster gameplay. The sprites are nicely detailed with smooth animation. Similar to the Atari ST, we get the arcade attract screens and also the intro with your plane crashing in the jungle. The music is excellent and a big step up from the Atari ST version. Two-player simultaneous action is also available, so you and a friend can blast the night away. The controls feel good despite not having that rotating joystick. This is one of the best home conversions that is not running under emulation. The MS-DOS version is up next, and despite it being an EGA title, it looks pretty good. That is, until it starts to move. The arcade gameplay is a bit on the slow side, but this one is twice as bad. It seems as if everything is moving at a snail's pace. While the sprites are fairly detailed, everything takes place in a windowed box, which limits the amount of play area you have. There are also only 4 enemies on the screen at once. Now, what about the sound? I don't know how else to say it, but it's farts and queefs all over again. Maybe I should expand my vocabulary. Bloops and bleeps are exactly what you get, so if I were you, I would shut the sound off in the options. Control-wise, it's not bad, but the slow gameplay really hurts it in my opinion. There is a 2-player option, so at least it has that going for it. An Apple II version was also released, but I could not get it running under 3 different emulators. A mobile version was also released, but took some liberties from the original. This time you can play as 3 different characters, with Clark and Ralph having 2 different versions of themselves. The second one having them dressed in their outfits from the King of Fighters trilogy. I could not get this one to work on either of my 2 emulators, so unfortunately I could not record any footage for it. The screenshots don't look half bad, although you do have to use the keypad to play. There were also versions of the game that were released on the PlayStation Network and Nintendo Switch, but these are running under emulation and are essentially arcade perfect. The entire trilogy was also released on Xbox One as part of SNK's 40th anniversary collection. These games came bundled with many other classic SNK arcade titles. Ikari Warriors is definitely a 2-player simultaneous run and gun classic. I always enjoyed finding it in the wild, putting a few quarters in and seeing just how far I could get. It wasn't an original concept by any means, but it did take the tried and true formula and expand on it by adding new gameplay features and innovative controls. If you are a fan of Commando or any other vertically scrolling games, give this one a shot. You'll be glad you did. If you like this video or any other content you find on my channels, be sure and give me a like, share, comment, and subscribe. Also, if you would like to support me on Patreon, please click the link below. Thank you.